When it comes to working in DaVinci Resolve, one of the areas that you might get a little tripped up in, especially if you're new to video, is frame rates. And don't worry, you are not alone, because I was in the same boat when I got started with DaVinci Resolve as well. I was confused by frame rates. How do I know what frame rate to use? What do I film in on my camera here? What do I use in DaVinci Resolve for my frame rate? I was all confused, and I had to do a whole bunch of research to figure out what makes sense, what should I film in, what should I edit in, how does this all work, because I'm confused. I came from photography with shutter speeds and apertures and ISOs, and I got all that down. But when it came to frame rates, I was a little confused. So today I'm going to be giving you a little bit of information about frame rates, from filming it on your camera to jumping into DaVinci Resolve and showing you how you can use the different frame rates to build your videos and get the looks that you want, how to get your slow motion, what to do with your talking headshots or your general footage. We're going to talk about all that, and hopefully this is going to help give you a little bit better of an idea of how to work with the frame rates, especially if you're new to video and you're new to DaVinci Resolve. So let's jump into frame rates here. When it comes to your talking headshots, maybe you're walking around, you're vlogging like this, you're making videos where you're, filming normal everyday kinds of things. It's not fast motion. You don't need slow motion. You're just filming and, vlogging, whatever it might be, capturing video that you want to edit later in DaVinci Resolve. Here's my recommendation. I would recommend that you use a frame rate, something similar to either 23.976 frames per second, 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, which I think is for Europe, or 30 frames per second. Now for me, typically I'm going to film my videos in 23.976 frames per second. In this case, I'm filming at 30 frames per second because I know that I'm going to add in some faster frame rates so we can get some good, smooth B-roll. So those lower frame rates are going to be great for any kind of talking head, any kind of normal video where you don't need slow motion. There's not a lot of fast action. They're going to give you a more cinematic look the closer you get to 23.976 frames per second. So you have to start by thinking about, what am I filming? How do I want to capture it? Do I need slow motion? Is it just normal, regular speed video where I'm talking? And that's going to help you start to decide what frame rates do I want to use for my general video. Now, I would recommend, like I said, either 23.976, 24, 25, or 30 frames per second. And whatever that frame rate is that you're using for the majority of your video, in this case 30 frames per second for me, that's what my timeline is going to be set up as once I jump into DaVinci Resolve. Now, what's the difference between those couple frame rates that I just mentioned? Well, you're going to get a little bit different motion blur, right? If we've got things moving around or whatever, the motion blur is going to look a little bit different in there. And, they say that, 23.976 frames per second or 24 frames per second might give you a more cinematic look. But 30 frames per second is great too. That works out good. And a lot of cameras do 30 frames per second. So it just depends on the look that you want. I'd recommend that you do some tests and see how it looks and decide what kind of frame rate do you want to use for your videos. Now, one thing to keep in mind that I didn't realize is that the higher the frame rate that you use, the bigger the files are that are going to come out of your camera. At least that's always been the case for me. Might be different for you depending on your camera, but that's always been the case for me. So now you might be thinking, okay, well, if I film the majority of my videos at one of those frame rates you just mentioned, what if I am filming fast motion, right? I got things moving real fast. I'm filming race cars, or maybe you want some slow motion, some of that smooth, buttery slow motion, which we're going to be talking about here in a minute. Well, in that case, you would want to boost up your frame rate, right? 30 frames per second, you can't really slow it down without it being a little choppy. So we need more frames per second, more information in the camera so that when we bring it into DaVinci Resolve, we have the ability to slow it down, but it still looks nice and smooth. And just giving a real quick shout out and plug here to Brevity. They sent out this backpack here for me to try out. It's awesome, it's great, but I used it as a prop so that I can get some footage at a higher frame rate in 60 frames per second. And I'm going to show you how we can take that into DaVinci Resolve and slow it down and get us some good, smooth, buttery slow motion. Now, if you have the option to go with a higher frame rate, for example, 120 frames per second, that's awesome. You can do that. That means you can slow it down even more and make it look even smoother and more buttery. But in my case, my cameras can only go to 60 frames per second. So the B-roll you'll see of this backpack is in 60 frames per second. I'll talk more about that once we jump into DaVinci Resolve. But if you are looking for a photo backpack, this thing is pretty sweet. I used it for a couple trips down in Philly and around that we had gone on recently, and it did a great job. So if you're looking for a bag, definitely check out one of these guys. I'll leave the link in the description down below for you. So when it comes to your higher frame rates, you might be thinking, well, how high of a frame rate should I go? Well, that kind of depends, I think, on one, how fast is the action that you want to slow down? How smooth do you want your footage to be? Even if you're doing some product photography, you could slow it down a whole lot, do 120 frames per second. So you've got the option of slowing it down to different speeds if you want. It really depends on the look that you're going for with the particular video that you're filming. So in general, before we jump into DaVinci Resolve, summing this up, a lower frame rate, so anything below 30, so either 30, 25, 24, or 23.976 frames per second, is going to be good for your talking head and your general types of shots, right? Maybe you're vlogging. That's what I would use. I would probably go 23.976 because typically that's what I like to use in the majority of my videos. So you're going to want to use one of those lower frame rates for your talking head and your general information or your general videos that you're filming. And that's going to be important because when we get into DaVinci Resolve, that's going to be the frame rate for our timeline. Now, for any clips that you want to really capture that motion, maybe it's fast race cars, somebody playing sports maybe, or you want some real nice, smooth, slow motion, you're going to want to boost up that frame rate. And you would want to go to at least 60 frames per second, but if you can do 120 frames per second, 240 frames per second, or something even more than that, then you're going to want to use those to be able to slow down your footage or capture more information and more frames so you're not missing the action. So I think that bit of information there about the slower frame rates versus the higher frame rates is the piece of the puzzle that I was kind of missing when I started to film video and I started to work in DaVinci Resolve. And then once I filmed them, okay, I have that understanding of how the frame rates work on the camera. But when I get into DaVinci Resolve over there on the computer, how do I know how to set that up? And that's what we're going to get into next. Now it's time to jump into DaVinci Resolve, and you might be thinking, how do I set up my project with the correct frame rate? Now, this is why it's important to use one of those lower frame rates if you're doing talking head stuff. And when we get into Resolve, as you can see on the screen here, I've got a project open. Now, I don't have a timeline. I don't have anything set up yet. And we've got two ways that we can set up our frame rates for our project or for our particular timeline. Number one way is to go into the project settings and we can make adjustments and set it to whatever we want. But if you want to do it a little bit easier of a way just to get started here, all you have to do is find the clip that has the frame rate that you want to use for your project. In my case, it's going to be 30 frames per second, and drag and drop it into DaVinci Resolve. So for example, I've got my clip. I'm just going to bring it over into Resolve and I'm going to drag and drop it into the media pool. Now, when I do that, Resolve is smart enough to say, hey, I noticed that's a different frame rate than that's already set up by default here in Resolve. Would you like to change your project settings? And now you can just go ahead and hit change if you want to change your project settings to match whatever that file is that you just brought in. Now, in my case, this file that I just brought in is at 30 frames per second, but typically my projects are filmed in 23.976, and that's why it asked me, do you want to change the frame rate of the project to match this clip that you're bringing in? And I said yes, so that way I don't have to go through and do the work manually. Now, if you want to double check your clip, you can come into your media pool here and you can check the attributes of your clip. A couple ways you can do it. If you hover over your clip here, you can just click on that little box in the right corner and you can see down here it says frame rate 29.97, which essentially is 30. So I know that everything is set up good and that's the clip that I wanted to bring in. Now, if you brought in the wrong clip, you can always do it again and bring in the clip that has the correct frame rate for you. So that's the quick and easy way to set your project frame rate. Now, if you want to set it all manually, you could do that too. Here's how you do that. So in Resolve, we want to come down to the little gear icon at the bottom, project settings. We're going to go ahead and click on that. It's going to open up our project settings window. And under master settings right here, this is where we can adjust our resolution right here. And then we have our timeline frame rate. And if we click on the drop down, you can see we've got all different frame rates in here that you can choose from. And you can make your project file, one of these faster frame rates if you want. I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's going to bog down your machine and it's going to slow it down. And if you want to use clips in slow motion, you need to have a slower frame rate so we can take the fast clip, slow it down, and we're still going to get nice, smooth playback. So you can set up your project either way, manually by going through the project settings or just dragging and dropping in a file, and Resolve will set the frame rate for you. So now we have our project settings set. But what about our timeline settings, right? You can have your timeline be a different frame rate than your project. They don't have to match. So let's go ahead and create a timeline, and I'll show you how to set your frame rate in your timeline. So go ahead and right click in your media pool. We're going to go timeline, create new timeline. That's going to bring up our create a new timeline window here. And now if you want it to be the same as your project settings, you can leave this option checked on right here. But if you wanted to change it, you got to uncheck that, and it's going to open up a bunch more options for us. So if I go to the format section here, you see our resolution. You can pick that, whether it's 1080, 4K, 6K, 8K, 12K. Who's doing 12K anyway? But then you can come down to your frame rate and you can change it right here. And this is going to be a specific frame rate for this particular timeline. It's not going to change the overall project settings. It's only going to change it for this timeline. So for me, I know my clip is at 29.97. So that's okay. I'm going to leave it like that. And then when it comes to frame rate, you shouldn't have to change anything else in this window. You can go ahead and click create. So now that we've got our timeline frame rate set up, before I drop in my clip, I actually want to sync up my good audio because I've got some good audio I recorded for this particular clip. So I want to sync that up. So we're going to do that real quick. So I brought in my good audio, real quick tip here. I'm just going to go ahead and select my right and left audio track from my good audio as well as my clip. I'm going to right click, going down to auto sync audio based on waveform. Boom, that's all you got to do. My good audio is going to be synced up with my video. So now that everything's synced up, I'm just going to drag and drop my clip down into my timeline. Now, if I play this back, it's going to look good. It's going to look smooth, no problem. Here's what it looks like. I was all confused, and I had to do a whole bunch of research to figure out what makes sense. What should I film in? What should I edit in? How does this all work? Because I'm confused. Okay, so the playback looks good there, right? And that is perfect for any of our talking head and normal footage, right? And the timeline frame rate wants to be whatever your normal footage is, your talking head footage, your slower frame rate footage. That's what you want your timeline to be in. So if our timeline is set up with that slower frame rate, once we bring in our footage that we want to say make slow motion, for example, we can do that and it's going to look good and it's going to look smooth. So now I'm going to come here and I'm going to make a bin for SlowMo footage, and I'm just going to drag and drop all of my slow motion footage into that file or that bin. So that way we can start working with our video clips. And I'm going to show you how you can use the frame rate that is higher, for example, in my case, 60 frames per second, how we can use that and make slow motion. I brought in that footage that I want to make slow-mo, and let's find the footage that has a frame rate of 60 frames per second. So this clip right here, if I hover on that little square at the bottom right, we can see that it is 59.9 frames per second. Also 60 frames per second. So I'm just going to drag and drop that clip into my timeline. Now, if I do this like this and I play through it, look at what happens here. It just plays back in real time, right? It doesn't look slow motion. It looks a little jittery, right? But Resolve is going to automatically take frames out of that 60 frames per second so that it fits in this timeline, which only needs 30 frames per second. So it's going to pull out every other frame and just play back the video, which is why it looks a little choppy and looks a little jittery there, right? So before you actually bring it into your timeline, here's what I'd recommend doing. Come to your clip. You want to right click on it and you want to come down to clip attributes, which is right here. Go ahead and click on that. Now, once that opens up, you're going to see a video section right here. We have frame rate. So we see that this clip is in 59.94 frames per second. Well, that's not what we want. We want it to play back at 30 frames per second, right? So we want to slow it down. We want it to take longer to play back so that it looks slow-mo and smooth. So you can come in here, click this drop down, and we want to change this to 29.97. Now, because this is half of 59, we're going to be able to play back this clip smoothly with no problems. Now, if we tried to take this clip and go down to 23.976 frames per second, then there's not enough information in that clip to only play back at 23 frames per second. So you have to be careful and look at your frame rate versus your timeline frame rate and figure out, can I cut my slow motion clip frame rate in half and it still have enough frames to play back smoothly in my timeline? So in this case, yeah, we can do that. So I'm going to click on this. And now if I hit OK, the whole clip is now going to play back in slow motion. So if I just drag and drop this into my timeline, and now I play through it, now it's all in slow motion. Let's mute that. We don't need the audio. So now it's all in slow motion. You can see it's moving really, really slow here. So now we can go ahead and add some image stabilization, and we can, change our retime controls to make it look even better. But we've got some good slow motion here to start with. Now, the other way that you can do it, let's say, for example, you brought your clip down into your timeline and you didn't realize, I forgot to change it up, up in the media pool there. I didn't change the frame rate. And now when I play through it in the timeline here, it's not slow motion. It's kind of going like regular speed. You can adjust it right here in the timeline for a particular clip if you'd like. So you can select your clip, right click, go to clip attributes. And again, we get this same window and we can see that this clip is at 59.94. So I want to change that because Resolve is pulling out frames anyway. So let's use all the frames that we have, slow that guy down, and we can use 29.97. So I'm gonna go ahead and click OK. Now, if I play through back clip, you can see it's a lot slower. It's slow motion. And now we're getting the look that we want from our clip. Now, let's say you accidentally filmed at the wrong frame rate, right? For example, I have a clip here that is filmed at 23.976 frames per second. It's not even at 30, right? So there's not even enough frames in there for it to look good in our timeline. If I drag that down, I drop it in my timeline, and I come here, I can just play it back, and it's going to play back, but it's going to look a little bit jittery. See how it's got the jitters there? Because it doesn't have enough frames in it to play back smoothly in our timeline. And if you wanted to take this and really slow it down, right? Let me just show you here. If I said, let's slow this down to 50%. Well, now take a look at it. Now it's going to be real jittery because it's missing a whole bunch of frames, right? So we can't get 30 frames out of there when there's only 23 to start with, and we slowed it down halfway. So now it's playing back at only, 13 frames a second or something like that. Now, there are some cool little tricks and tips to kind of help get around that if you do mess up. Real quick, just to show you guys, if I open my inspector right here, come to video, all the way to the bottom here, we've got retime process. Change that to optical flow, motion estimation. Speed warp is the best, but it does a real number on your machine, so I'm going to go enhanced better. Change those two, let it render up, give it a minute, and then it may help with some of that playback if you pick the wrong frame rate or if it's just not looking good for you. And you can even do these two settings with some of your good smooth slow-mo, and it's going to make it look even better. So here's what that looks like by changing those settings for this particular clip. So you can see even still, it doesn't look great. It's a little bit better. It's still a little jittery because it has to render out. It'll look a little bit better when it renders, but still it's not going to be as smooth as you'd want it to be if you use that higher frame rate. So the reason you need to think about what frame rate you're using and what frame rate your timeline is going to be in is because you got to do a little bit of math, right? So if my timeline is in 30 frames per second, I can film a clip at 60 frames per second and play it back at 50% of the speed, and then it's going to be in slow motion. Now, if I filmed a clip in 120 frames per second, and I'm still using the same timeline that we have here, the 30 frames per second timeline, I can slow down that 120 FPS clip by a quarter, right? I can slow it down by 0.25% or down to 25% speed, and it's going to play back real slow and smooth, and it's going to have enough frames to be able to make that clip look good. So you do have to do a little bit of math when you're working with the different frame rates and you're trying to get different, speed, slow motions. You just got to think about it a little bit and make sure that whatever your, base timeline frame rate is, you're talking head stuff, make sure that your slow motion footage or anything that you want to film at a higher frame rate is a multiple of that existing or base timeline frame rate. And then you shouldn't have any problems with it once you get it into Resolve. It should play back smooth and look good regardless of what frame rate it is, as long as it's a multiple of your timeline frame rate. For example, if I filmed in 24 frames per second, then I want my slow motion footage to be in, say, 50 frames per second, because then that's what's going to have the correct number of frames to play back in my timeline and look the way I want it to look. Now, sometimes you do pick the wrong frame rate on accident, and I've done it too myself. And I do have a video on that, on how you can make some adjustments and try and get the footage to look good. So I'll link that up here. I'll also throw it at the end of this video in a card. You can check that out if you filmed at the wrong frame rate and you're not sure what to do. So that is the gist of frame rates here in DaVinci Resolve. How do we set them up? What do we use when we get into DaVinci Resolve? And it starts when you're filming, right? You have to think about it before you even hit that record button, so that once you get into DaVinci Resolve here, you're going to be good to go and you can work with the footage you have, and it's going to come out looking the way that you want it to look. So with that said, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you learned a little something. If you did, smash that like button for me, would you? All right, we will see you in the next video. Peace.